All right, here we go. We are live. Surprise, we're here. We're early. We're never early. We don't even know what to do when we're early. So let's do this. All right, today on the show, we are talking about what it means to pass the blame. What does it mean when in fantasy we go, it's not my fault I've lost this much. It's not my fault I'm going to miss the playoffs. I'm going to blame the refs. I'm going to blame the players, even though it's all out of our control. And so what happens in fantasy, what happens in life when we actually acknowledge, my bad? How does it free us? Let's unpack it. This is the Fantasy Football Fellowship podcast, where we unpack fantasy, faith, and life. We are live. So glad to be with you. I'm Bryce Johnson with Tripp Smith. He's a pastor at Hope Community Church, and we are your fantasy coaches here to encourage you and help you win while you play fantasy football with purpose. As we provide fantasy advice, we won't always be right, but we hope will be convincing. We are coming to you live from the Unpacking It Ministry studio here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Be sure to check out fantasyfootballfellowship.com. We hope that you are enjoying the season. If you are a member, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know how it's going with your league. Our hope is that you enjoy the breakout content each week as we take fantasy concepts, relate them to the Bible, relate it to life, and then you get to discuss it with your league. So how's it been going? Let us know. Leave your comments, send me an email, and always love hearing from you. So check out fantasyfootballfellowship.com. And this time of year, we start thinking about the fantasy playoffs. The year is winding down. Trade deadlines are happening. So a lot going on in the fantasy world. And so we will talk a lot about that today. We also need to get into some bandwagon riding. What bandwagons are we jumping on or off for the home stretch? And is there anybody left on the waiver wire? I'm in a 14-team league. And if you looked at our waiver wire, it is so bleak. I mean, you are looking for diamonds in the rough. Now, I did pick up Roschon Johnson this week, got into the end zone. So that was a nice one. I did not pick up Isaiah Likely, which was a miss. So that was unfortunate. But we will do some accountability and confession on the show today. And we will also do this week's breakout about blaming, making excuses, and owning our mistakes in fantasy and in life. All right. It's time to begin with a little bit of fantasy shenanigans. Let's do it.
Fantasy shenanigans.
All right, let's start with Monday Night Football. Last night, I called my buddy Luke, who used to do the Unpacking the podcast with me, and he's a big Cowboys fan, and he's out on the season. He's like, we're done. Forget about it. And they hung in there. It was all right. They made it somewhat interesting, but for the most part, it was Joe Mixon all night long. And Tripp, as I say hello to you, I have to get this off my chest from the start. So I went into Monday Night Football last night. I was up in all 5 of my leagues thinking, all right, could I do another 5-0 week? It would be awesome. And so it all came down to Joe Mixon. Could Joe Mixon score less than 35 points? All he had to do was score less than that, and I win. Well, what does he do? He scored. How much did he score? He scored like 38 points. It was unbelievable. 39. He scored 39 points. I lost by 7, and that was my one loss for the week. So I'm very salty about Joe Mixon. Of course, if you listen to the show since the summer, I have been out on Joe Mixon, and boy, was I wrong, and I paid for it on Monday Night Football. So how are you doing, Tripp?
He's been a revelation this season, hasn't he? And he definitely falls into that category that it feels like we've been talking about almost every week of bell cow running backs who got traded to new teams and have been featured in a major way on their team. He has been the centerpiece. This is crazy to say with a quarterback like CJ Stroud, but he's been the centerpiece of that Texans offense. And I think because he was hurt for a few weeks at the beginning of the season, we don't think of him in that same category as like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. But when he's been on the field, he's been just as good as those guys. He's been great. And yes, that was brutal. If you went into that Monday night game last night and there he dropped a 40-pointer on you, which is always rough at the end of the week there.
It's remarkable. I called my buddy on the way home yesterday and fairly confident, like thinking, all right, I should be all right. So I left him a voicemail and I said, come on, man. I got to beat you. Forget this. Like, there's no way that Joe Mixon, come on. I mean, he scored over 30 twice this year, but it seems unlikely. So have a nice night. Yeah, he got the last laugh.
He got the last laugh, man. And it was a great performance from Mixon. I mean, this is that time of the year, particularly if you manage multiple leagues, where you start to see, okay, here are my teams that have a shot.
Yep.
And here are the ones that I kind of need to, I'm not going to say put them out of their misery, because what I want to do, this is just a good PSA for people. If you're one of those guys that you're in the bottom of your league, you're pretty sure you're not making the playoffs, for the sake of your league, just for the quality of your league, play out the season, keep trying to win every week, think of yourself as the spoiler and try to beat some of the other teams in your league. It's just fun when the week before the fantasy playoffs, that guy who's in 11th place in the league pulls off the upset against that guy who's in 4th place and knocks him out of the playoffs. So it's fun to play spoiler. It's good for the quality of your league. I got a couple of teams that are probably not making the playoffs, but I'm going to keep fighting, mostly for the joy of playing spoiler and messing up some of those guys who are pushing to get into the playoffs.
All right, so I'll go on the opposite side of it. So that's absolutely good encouragement.
Drop out?
No. Good encouragement. I'm going to talk about teams that you're in the playoffs. You're feeling good.
Okay.
Here's my encouragement to you. Target teams, especially this week, that have a ton of players on buys. Even if that means you sacrifice a win, go get somebody that can help you in the playoffs, because there are teams that are desperate right now. They are trying to win this week. They need a win so bad because they want to make the playoffs, or they don't want to finish last. And so they really need a win, and they're looking at their roster and it's buy. Everybody's on a buy. So go trade for some of those guys that are on buys. You take the hit if you're already secure in the playoffs. Yeah, if you finish 3rd or 5th, who cares? And 6 teams make the league, you'll be fine. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try it. I'll let you know how it goes. But going into tonight, waiver wire, those are the kind of trades that I think can benefit those of you that are playing for a championship.
Absolutely. I love to do that. Love to prey on people's bye week panic.
Yes.
Also love at this point in the season, it might be a little early. I'll probably start to do this next week. If I know I'm making the playoffs, go see what defenses are playing the Carolina Panthers, the Las Vegas Raiders, the Jacksonville Jaguars, those bottom dweller teams in the first week or two. Don't try to kind of play out the whole 3-week scenario. Your only goal is to win in that first week of the playoffs and make it to the second round. But you can start to sort of project some of those playoff matchups and what kind of defenses. I know most of our leagues, or at least the leagues you commission, don't have defenses. Any league that I have with a defense, I'm going to see who's playing the Panthers, who's playing the Jaguars, who look terrible in the first round. You can sort of do the same thing especially with quarterback matchups. I would say if you've been kind of doing the QB streamer thing and you've got a middling quarterback, go make sure that they're not playing like the Denver Broncos or the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? The Detroit Lions the first week of the season, because those are some brutal defenses. That was the big story of the weekend for me, was how good the Denver Broncos and the Pittsburgh Steelers defenses looked this weekend. And I don't want anything less than an elite quarterback to be playing one of those teams in the first week of the playoffs.
Oof, that's a great point. Now, you can overemphasize matchups and almost like talk yourself out of certain players based on matchups. So you do have to be careful with that. It cost me a few years ago, actually. I made that mistake. I looked way too far ahead at matchups and made a silly trade that I thought was going to benefit me down the line, and it didn't. So you do have to just, be wise. And to your point, it's really about the elite defenses that you have to avoid. But the middle of the ground, you'll be fine.
You're right. Yeah.
Don't
overthink it.
Don't overthink the matchups in that regard. Other big takeaways from the weekend. Here's the biggest shenanigan. Last week, we talked about Jared Goff and his 5 interception performance. He follows that up, and he rewarded those of us who are Goff loyalists. Guess what I did, Trip? I started him in not 1, but 2 leagues this week. I stuck him right back in, baby. I said, I'm not jumping off that Jared Goff bandwagon. And he rewarded us with almost 50 points. It was remarkable. It was like, wait, Jared Goff's still in the game? I mean, I wasn't even getting greedy. I was happy about when midway through the third quarter, he had 30 some points or whatever. And I'm like, hey, this is awesome. They kept him out there. He kept scoring. It was remarkable. And now I'm feeling confident with him as my guy down the stretch. I just wish he could play Jacksonville a few more times. Is that off the? That's not on the schedule.
The Jacksonville should just shut the team down, man. I mean, that they got obliterated. And how has Doug Peterson not been fired yet?
I thought he was done.
Yeah, it's Tuesday afternoon. I mean, they are on bye this week, but I think you do it sooner rather than later. He should be done. Hard to understand what's going on there, but yeah, I mean, it seems like the Detroit Lions, I heard, at least like in the betting markets, are now the favorites to win the Super Bowl over the Chiefs after this weekend. They look really, really good, and they're not the kind of team that takes their foot off the gas.
No,
They love to run up the score.
I love it.
And so, man, yeah, that was a fun weekend, and what a turnaround for Jared Goff. I'll tell you the shenanigan for me that was a continuing one from last week is we talked last week about the light, the orientation of the sunlight coming through the windows of Cowboy Stadium and how terrible that was. You spent so much money on this immaculate stadium, you can't even figure out how to block the sun from players' eyes. Well, this week there were pieces of metal falling from the ceiling. Did you see that?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, one of them that was a huge piece of the stadium ceiling that fell down onto the field while the players are warming up before the game. I don't know if I'm playing. I don't know if I'm going out on that field to play that game after I see that giant piece of metal fall off. And apparently there was an employee up in the rafters picking up smaller pieces that had been kind of falling and breaking off. So things are literally falling apart in Dallas. That's to say nothing of the team. And I mean, I guess they're saying McCarthy is not going to be fired either, but I think you just kind of pack it in there. I think you give Trey Lance a shot to start at quarterback.
You're a big Trey Lance guy. You're riding that. You're riding a trip.
They traded for him.
Carry the bandwagon.
They traded a 4th round pick for him. The season is not going anywhere. So at this point, see what you have there and either try to boost his stock so that you can trade him away or figure out if he's a guy that you want to keep. And I mean, the season is over. It's a disaster in Dallas. It is a huge mess. And that makes me worried for like a guy like Rico Dowdle, who's sort of been a guy that I can kind of plug in as like a flex play, maybe an RB2 on like a rough week for buys. I'm worried that team is going to pack it in and just not play very inspired moving forward.
A very fair question is, why would CeeDee Lamb continue to play?
Mm-hmm. Little nagging injuries. That shoulder injury is something that can get worse if he falls on it the wrong way. It's not like a maintenance thing where he can't injure it any worse. Like he can mess up his shoulder. So that's a real concern. I have him on a couple teams, and things are not
very concerned. I was actually surprised he even played last night, but
he played. 93, total yards, scrimmage yards. So.
He did all right. Yeah. But when you get to this point in the season, though, of course they still have a contract, right? You guys got to play, and if you're healthy enough, you play. But as the last few weeks, we know, hey, I'm a little sore. I'm out. And I will not be surprised by that to be the case in Dallas for sure. The other big story of the weekend, Anthony Richardson. Wow. The fantasy community. We everybody was so excited about him going into the season. He was a huge letdown. I know he was dropped in many leagues. Some people hung on to him, which is shocking. But if you hung on to him, if you were crazy enough to start him this past week, he was awesome. And so 31 fantasy points, 20 of 30, 272 yards, passing touchdown plus 2 rushing touchdowns. Are you on the bandwagon? What do we do here? You all in?
No, I don't think so.
It's one game. Is he back?
As someone who is a believer in Anthony Richardson coming into the season and who would genuinely like to see him succeed in the long run, this was encouraging. And maybe Shane Steichen is just a good coach. They took him out for a few weeks, let him learn a little bit, let him decompress a little bit. And then put him back in. I think this is probably more telling about the Jets defense and just the state of the entire Jets team. The score was close, but Indianapolis hasn't looked great. It wasn't like the Jets didn't put up a fight. It's just like they kind of looked uninspired the whole game, And
I can't watch the Jets.
You can't watch the Jets.
I can't stand watching the Jets.
How can you watch the Jets, man? And now they just fired their GM, and so maybe the key for them is just to keep firing one key person other than Aaron Rodgers every week going forward, so that they can pretend like the problem was something other than Aaron Rodgers. Every time you fire somebody, you get a 1 week boost. And then you remember like, oh yeah, this quarterback is not good. And that is our problem. And so, yeah, I think it's probably more representative of the Jets defense and the struggles that they have had of late. So I'm not saying I'm totally pessimistic on Anthony Richardson. I wouldn't want to, I want to see it a few more times before I'm counting on him in my starting lineup. So maybe keep him on your bench if you've got him, but I haven't looked to see who they're playing next week, but let's check it out here. They got Detroit. I don't feel great about starting.
I know. It'd be a little bit of a wake-up call for him. But
they've got Detroit and then New England, who is not a great defense right now. And then they have a Week 14 bye. So I'm certainly not dropping Anthony Richardson, but I want to have a contingency plan. I don't want to be counting on him going into the playoffs in Week 15 when they play Denver. So yeah, he's and then Tennessee, he's got a tough schedule. So I'm changing my answer to based on that schedule. I got to have somebody else that I can count on because I wouldn't be playing him until week 17 of the playoffs against the Giants, and by then you're not going to have any confidence in him. I don't think so.
That's why it's great to just be a Jared Goff owner.
Just be just one of these boring guys.
We're loving life.
He's either going to throw 4 TDs or 5 interceptions on any given week. Yeah,
talk about a roller coaster ride. Holy cow! But all right, one other player we got to mention in shenanigans, because I would vote that there is no other fantasy player more annoying than the one and only Taysom Hill. I mean, there can't be another more annoying fantasy player, because as soon as you pick up Taysom Hill, he stinks. As soon as you drop him, he goes off. As soon as he gets picked up on someone else's team, he beats you. You lose to Taysom Hill. If you ever start him, he scores 0 points. I mean, at least that's been my experience. And I accidentally drafted him in a league, and I was so upset at myself. And then, of course, I dropped him eventually, and then now he goes off. So this week, 46 fantasy points. I mean, come on. 7 rushes for 138 yards and 3 touchdowns, 8 catches for 50 yards. I think he threw a pass. He had a kick return for 42 yards. There's not a greater athlete, weapon, versatile player in all of football. But at the same time, he does it like 3 times a year, and then the other 15 games he is non-existent. I don't know what else to say. I mean, he's just an annoying player. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. If you remember before the season started, I talked about the strategy of waiting till the last pick in your draft and then taking Taysom Hill. It seems like in every draft that I actually had, he got taken in like the second to last round, So I didn't end up with him on a lot of teams. The problem is that you're exactly right. When he has that stretch of bad games, you go and find another tight end that you can play. And then if you still have Taysom Hill on your bench, you always have him on your bench for these 40-point games that he seems to have once a season. And then you put him in next week, he's going to score 4 points. He's going to score 4 points when you got him in your starting lineup. You can never time, unless you just say, I'm just taking the L's with Taysom Hill and just keeping him in the lineup because I know he's going to win me 2 games a season by himself. That's kind of the only strategy that you can employ with him, because otherwise you always have him on his bench when he does this. Now, I will say he got a pretty bad chest injury early in the season. And so it's hard for me, it's hard to say. Maybe he would be a 7 to 10 point per game guy if he hadn't had, he still has been coming back from injury, and it's been the last couple of games when he's been truly healthy. So again, if I have him, I'm not dropping him, and I might even be tempted to start him this week, but just with the understanding that you never know what's going to happen there. So
has he ever had back-to-back good weeks?
I think he has. I remember a couple years ago where he had a little streak of like tight end one, he was playing more quarterback. They were using him in more of that wildcat style of play. But it seems like Darren Rizzi, that new coach, is just like a player's coach who's looking to have a good time, knows they're probably not making the playoffs. And, he's just one of these guys who is rallying the team, doing something wild and goofy every game. And maybe Taysom Hill matches up perfectly with the persona of this interim head coach that they have. Just kind of like let it all hang out, leave everything on the field. So I'd keep an eye on Taysom Hill. Let's put it that way. If I see it a couple more times, not 40 points, obviously, but if he's scoring double-digit points at tight end, I think you could do a lot worse than Taysom Hill if he stays healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine he's probably taken in most leagues, but if he happens to be on your waiver wire, I guess you roll the dice.
Don't go out and trade for him. If he's on the waivers, I think you put him on your bench. Just keep an eye on him is what I'm saying. If you've got him on your team, don't drop him.
He's just put 40 points.
I know. You're not going to drop him now, but I think some people could hear what we're saying and say, well, I missed the good Taysom Hill game for the season. And so he's useless for the rest of the year. No, that's
fair. Actually, I'd probably go with that. Yeah.
No,
I might side with that.
If I see it a couple more times, I might just say I'm rolling with him in the playoffs and hoping that he gets me 10 points and maybe something crazy happens and he goes off for 25, in which case he's just won me a week, and those are the kind of things that are kind of make or break in the playoffs. You're looking, you need a few players to blow up. And I think that you could do worse at tight end for a blow-up player if the rest of your team is solid than Taysom Hill. Now, he could also blow up your season by scoring 0 points, but I'm willing to go with that boomer bust guy if I'm kind of like, if I sneak into the playoffs as the 6th seed and I just got to pull off an upset against like the top dog in the league. I'll throw Taysom Hill in there and say, come on, baby.
You can have him.
Yeah.
I'd probably rather put in Dalton Schultz or some boring guy like that. Just give me the solid 7 points so I don't have to risk it. But anyway, no, it's that was definitely some shenanigans watching him score left and right.
He's the ultimate shenanigan guy.
He is. First team all fantasy shenanigans.
Nice, yeah.
No question about it. All right, well let's shift gears and we'll jump into this week's breakout topic where we take fantasy concepts related to life and faith. And one of the key things in fantasy football is things go wrong. Right? We make mistakes in fantasy football. We pick the wrong player. We start Taysom Hill in week 8, and then we don't start him in week 12 or 11, whatever it was. And so it happens all throughout the season. And we know that, for the most part, we can be confident in our fantasy managing abilities, right? We'll draft a team. We'll put together a good lineup. But we also know mistakes happen, things go wrong, and our team doesn't do what we expect it to. And, we lose certain matchups. And what do we end up doing? We make excuses. We make excuses for why certain things went wrong. And we're also, if we're honest, we're guilty of blaming somebody else when our fantasy team does not deliver. And so, I lost one of my 5 teams this matchups this week because I lost to Joe Mixon. So my blame is on Joe Mixon. But if I was really honest, whose fault it was? It was my fault because I benched I played Cedric Tillman and benched Khalil Shakir, T. Higgins, and JSN. All of those guys would have won the week for me. Instead, I played Cedric Tillman. Now, the thinking wasn't all that bad because Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore scored 1,000 points. And if Cedric Tillman was that guy, I would have been okay. But he was not that guy. He was left out of the fun with Jameis. There's another fantasy shenanigans, first team all shenanigans, Jameis Winston. But the point is, here's what happens when we have poor decision making in fantasy. We tell ourselves, or sometimes we even tell others, "Oh, it's not my fault. It's not my fault." What do? We blame the actual NFL players that are on our roster or on the other team. We blame all the injuries on our fantasy team. Well, the reason I lost is because this guy's injured. Or we blame the fantasy analyst who told us to start that player. It's all his fault. I listened to him. And then we'll also blame, the refs for not giving the player the catch. If we thought a guy caught a touchdown and it was called the other way. We'll blame the fantasy schedule sometimes. I like to blame the silly buys, right? Why is everybody on a buy in the same week? We'll blame our loss on, having too many players on a buy. We'll blame, all right, our opponent was just lucky. We'll blame luck or whatever, whatever that means. And then we'll blame our bad draft on our draft position. Well, yeah, the reason I didn't have a good draft is because I didn't draft in the top 5. Okay. So all of the excuses, all of the blaming takes place in fantasy football. Of those things that I just listed off, where are you guilty, Trip? Let's hear some honesty here.
I loved as you just listed those off. I just thought to myself, when it comes to coming up for reasons that aren't my fault for the reason that I lose fantasy games and fantasy seasons, I am as creative and prolific as you can possibly be. I could always come up with a new excuse. I could always come up with something outside of my control. For me, it's not any one of these that jumps out. It's just the cumulative effect of them over the course of the season that causes me just to not, at the end of every week, if I lose a game, I want to reset. Don't blame the circumstances. Don't blame what is the next step that I can take to sort of fix my team and give myself a shot to win in this coming week. So, I love to blame the injury bug. I'm not one of those guys that kind of watches the refs and looks for crazy results on the field and blames them for a lost point here or there, because usually that's not the difference between winning or losing. But I love to blame the injury bug. And as we've talked about many times, when I have a bad draft strategy or a draft philosophy coming into the season,
a bad bath will ruin things too.
A bad bath. Yeah. You want to take a good bath before you draft.
That's right.
When I have a bad draft strategy coming into the season, I love to say, well, it's not me that's bad at this. It's the NFL that's dumb. And it's like, no. These are the guys who are playing real football on the field. You can't blame them for the bad philosophy that you brought into the draft. So this one resonates with me. I'm good at coming up with excuses.
We all are. And ultimately, though, we just need to be willing to own our mistakes as a fantasy manager and say, yeah, I thought this guy was going to be great. He's not. I missed. I whiffed. I thought this team was going to be much better. If you were in on the Jets, you were wrong. It was you were wrong to think that Aaron Rodgers was going to lead this team to this playoff type season, which was going to help us in fantasy. And so we're the ones as fantasy managers who drafted the players. We make the lineup decisions. We add and drop players on the waiver wire, and we either accept or reject the trade offers. And of course, so much in fantasy football is out of our control. We absolutely have to acknowledge that. But it does not give us the green light to just always blame and complain and make excuses. You know the guy in your fantasy league who's this way. And maybe you are that way, but there's always one guy. I'm thinking of a guy in my league. It's just like, no matter what, at the end on Sunday afternoon, he's whining and complaining, and it's always somebody else's fault, and poor me, and that's what happens, right? And so what if in fantasy, and then now as we translate this to life, we were willing to go, you know what? It was my fault. And we just own our mistakes. And we just say, I'm the manager. It was my bad. And I didn't choose the right players this year. And in our own lives, when we make mistakes, we make the wrong decision, instead of looking around for someone to point the finger at and to make excuses and to blame and complain, we just go, yeah, my bad. I blew it. I thought that was the right thing to do. I missed on that. I miscalculated. I was wrong, or I gave in to temptation there. I was off, and it was my bad. It was my bad. And so the temptation for us is to blame, all the different people in our lives. I'm guilty of blaming my wife, right? I'm looking around. If somebody didn't do something, it's got to be her fault, right? Instead of just owning it. But whether it's our, at our work and our bosses, or we blame someone else that we work with, or if you're in school and it's classes and teachers and, you play sports, it's your coaches, it's the refs, you're always looking for someone to blame versus just saying, no, I either got to work harder. I got to make wiser decisions. I got to put in more preparation. I got to, get somewhere earlier, whatever it may be. We've just got to own the situation. And again, so much is out of our control in life. We know that, but we are, and in some ways there are reasons we could justify complaining, right? There are things that, you could complain about that. I understand wanting to complain about that, but we have to ask ourselves, where does that get us? What does that ultimately accomplish? Because in the end, we are responsible for the choices that we make. And when we make mistakes, are we willing to just point the finger at ourselves and go, yeah, that was my fault. It's my bad. So here's what scripture says. 1 John 1:8-9 tells us, if we say we have no sin, and this is the Amplified, refusing to admit that we are sinners, we delude ourselves, and the truth is not in us. His word does not live in our hearts. If we freely admit that we have sinned and confess our sins, he is faithful and just, true to his own nature and promises, and will forgive our sins and cleanse us continually from all unrighteousness, our wrongdoing, everything not in conformity with his will and purpose. And so when it comes to especially the sin in our lives, it's coming before God and saying, my bad. Please forgive me. I need your grace. I need your forgiveness. And then also doing that with other people. My bad. It was my fault. Here's where I missed. Here's why I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just taking ownership of it. And there's freedom in that. There's cleansing in that. And there's joy and peace that comes from not hanging on to the blame, the complaining, the excuses. Is that fair, Trip?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to Genesis 3, the reason that the story of Adam and Eve is in the Bible, the reason that those first chapters of Genesis in the Bible is because they are our origin story. I love superhero movies. I love a good origin story. We get our origin story in the Bible and Genesis, and it tells us so many things about human nature and about where our sort of sin patterns and struggles come from. And when Adam and Eve commit the first sin, you go look in Genesis 3, what's the first thing they do? They try to hide from God. So they go hide. And then he comes and finds them. What's the second thing they do? They blame shift. They start blaming everyone else except for themselves for the sin that they have committed. And it is the pattern of what we do when we sin in our lives to this day. My first thought is maybe I can hide this from God and other people. So I hide it. And then my second thought is on the off chance that I get caught, I start blame shifting, and so it's a great personal Bible study that you could do is to look at that story in Genesis 3 and then go look at that passage that you just read from 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1 describes the inverse of that. It describes coming into the light, bringing ourselves to the Lord to quote unquote, get caught by him, to expose ourselves to him, to tell the truth about what we have done without any blame shifting. And the incredible thing that it says is that in that moment, you'll receive mercy for your sin. You'll receive restoration for the Lord, and it will also enrich your fellowship with other believers. So I love the first chapter of 1 John because it says, walk in the light, try to get caught. If you are a sinner, the very worst thing that you can do is to not get caught by God, because when he catches us in Christ, he always has mercy for us. He always has restoration for us. And one of the best ways that we can do that is to confess our sin to other people as well. So blame shifting, ironically, even though it feels like the safest and most secure route for us, is actually the way that we stay trapped in sin. We don't enjoy the mercy of the Lord. And it takes agency away from us. It takes responsibility away from us. I'm just a victim. It's someone else's fault. But when we say, I was party to this, this was my fault, even if you're making such an important point, Bryce, that there are sort of factors in a broken world that are outside of our control that affect us and do cause us to make bad decisions, to sin, to stumble. And it would be wrong to ignore those and negate those. But there was a time in my life, not too recently, I'm talking too much here, but let me just tell this story. When some close friends of mine were trying to confront me with a pattern of sin in my life that they saw in me. And whenever they would do it, I would say, okay, I hear what you're saying. I think there's some truth to it, but X, Y, and Z, right? I would always say, but you're not doing this in quite the right way. What you're saying isn't exactly true, yada, yada, yada. I'm a victim of this circumstance, and I'm shifting blame until I let go of that, but X, Y, and Z. I couldn't really experience the healing that the Lord had for me. And he did have healing for me, but I had to let go of that blame shifting and to own what I had done. And it's such a beautiful thing that grace allows us to do.
Amen. It's healing, it's cleansing, and it's allowing us to move forward, actually learning from the mistakes. But if we don't acknowledge that they're mistakes, how do we learn from it?
Right.
If we don't acknowledge that it's sin, then we're just going to continue down that path. And so, we've got to acknowledge first off that we're sinners in need of Jesus, in need of his grace and forgiveness and what he did on the cross to save us from our sin. And then, as we continue to live in this broken world, the challenges of sin continue to give into temptation. And so when we do, we admit it and we, grieve the sin in our lives and bring it before the Lord and go, yeah, I blew it. My bad. And so as we surrender our lives to Jesus and follow him, confessing and repenting it becomes the rhythm of our lives. And then we receive the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness, and we're able to continue this cleansing and moving forward. And as we parallel this to fantasy football, we make mistakes all season long in fantasy, but if we deny it or make excuses and blame, we don't learn from it. We don't adjust. We just kind of keep going down that same pattern. But as soon as we go, yeah, all right, I'm not making the right decisions when it comes to my wide receiver position. All right, here, I'll confess. I continued to put Deontay Johnson in. I mean, come on. It's time for me to cut Deontay Johnson or trade him. I've got to move on from Deontay Johnson. He's not good in my life. It's a negative, but I got to admit it. I got to admit that it was a mistake to keep him and start him and everything else. Same thing in life. What are those things that we continue to just to say, well, it's not that bad, or, oh, it's his fault. It's his fault. It's somebody else's fault. I could blame the Panthers for trading Deontay Johnson, right? But it's my fault for keeping him at this point. So what does that look like in our own lives? And then Proverbs 28:13 says, people who conceal their sins will not prosper, but if they confess and turn from them, they will receive mercy. And then we can kind of echo this from Psalm 32:5. I acknowledge my sin to you, God, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. And so it's hard to admit when we're wrong. We want to blame. It's easy to blame. But man, it's so much better when we can experience the freedom, the healing, and just, take responsibility for our behavior, our mindsets, our choices, and continue to rely on God and his power, the power of the Holy Spirit within us to make wise choices, to know his word, so that we do make more and more wise choices, and we have the strength to resist temptation. We don't have to fall into sin. And so we can overcome sin and continue to, persevere. But we can't do it in our own strength either. But when we do fall and do give in, it's quickly go, ooh, my bad. And I'll say this, when it comes to this whole conversation of blaming and admitting when I'm wrong, I struggle when it comes sometimes with marriage and Jody and I, the navigation of day to day, whose fault is what, or I make a lot of excuses, I should say. I make a lot of excuses for things. Here's why I didn't take out the trash. It was raining or whatever. But I will say this is a win for me as a dad. I have taught my daughters, and I demonstrate it in my life, because I remember getting this advice a while ago. Just be quick to tell them, my bad. It's my fault. It was my fault. Daddy made a mistake there. That was wrong. Or a lot of times I used to say I was wrong. My 5-year-old is always right now. And I can't believe I live in a house of women and they're always right and I'm always wrong. But I admit when I'm wrong. And I think it was this morning even, or yesterday, it's something about food or something. But Maddie goes, hey, I was wrong about that. And I was like, yes, great. You admit you were wrong. You admit you were wrong. And so I want my daughters to admit when they're wrong, admit when they make mistakes. Because when you can live in that house of grace, we talked earlier on the Unpacking It podcast about culture, a culture of grace and admitting, not a culture of blaming, not a household of blame and making excuses and all that. No, we own when we blow it. So anyway, that's a little pat on the back, but also, hey, I need some encouragement when it comes to making excuses with Jody. So any final thoughts, Tripp, as we wrap up this breakout?
I love that, man. That illustration really resonates. I mean, when it's the great thing about having kids is that they become little pictures, little microcosms of all of your sin struggles and unhealthy patterns. But the opportunity to disciple them in grace is such a beautiful one. I love that idea. We in this world, we create cultures of shame and we create cultures of blame. And neither one of those is healing. Neither one of those is freeing. Jesus came into the world to create a culture, a kingdom of grace. And when we move into that, the first time it's really, really hard to confess your sin, to not shift the blame, but just to say, I was wrong and I need forgiveness. The first time you do it, it can feel really hard and painful and sort of awkward and alien. But when you start to develop that as a habit and a discipline, a skill in your life, it gets easier and easier. And you start to model it for other people such that they feel like, hey, Bryce is the kind of person, Tripp is the kind of person that I can come to and confess my sin specifically to them. And I know that I'm going to be met with mercy. It turns out that's exactly what Jesus is inviting us to in our relationships with other people. So I love that, man. I love to hear that about your family. That inspires me to want to do that with my boys a little bit better too. So
absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely. It's not that they do it all the time, but yeah, at least that's the culture I'm trying to create. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll leave us with this. James 4:6. But he gives us more and more grace through the power of the Holy Spirit to defy sin and live an obedient life that reflects both our faith and our gratitude for salvation. Therefore, it says, God is opposed to the proud and haughty, but continually gives the gift of grace to the humble who turn away from self-righteousness. And so at the core of being willing to own our mistakes is humility. That it's saying, yeah, I'm a sinner. I blew it. I need forgiveness. It requires humility to do that. So I hope that is encouraging as well. So there you go. That's this week's breakout. You can read more about this and discuss it with your fantasy league. Just go to fantasyfootballfellowship.com and you sign up to be a member for free and access all the content there. We release that each week on Tuesday afternoons. All right. Speaking of confession, we have built it into this show. We do it almost every week. We do confession and accountability. The players that we've missed on, the decisions that we've gotten wrong throughout the fantasy season. I've already acknowledged Joe Mixon. I've already acknowledged Deontay Johnson. Sure, I got it in there that I went 4-1 this week. So you know where I stand. You know what's going on. But I make some mistakes along the way. I also need to, let's see, I got those two to confess. I've got to mention this. Marquez Valdez-Scantling. I laughed about him last week. Gosh, he did it again. 18.7 fantasy points. It's unbelievable. So he has 3 touchdowns in 2 games since joining the Saints. I was way off on him. I did not pick him up. Forget about it. I'm out on the Saints. I'm going to remain out on the Saints, but there are some moments where I miss out on some opportunities. So I was wrong there. I will just acknowledge this. I'm not sure if this was, I think it was a good decision, but I'll let you be the judge. I turned down a trade this past week. I have Chase Brown. I was offered Brian Robinson and Audric Estime. And I said, no, I kept Chase Brown. I think that's going to be okay. But if Estime really went off, maybe I missed out on an opportunity there. But Chase Brown continues to deliver for the Bengals. The Bengals can't win to save their life. I hope they continue to play hard through the end of the season. It makes me a little nervous with their record and being out of the mix at the end. But anyway, that's what I've got to acknowledge and confess this week. What about you, Trip?
All those are great, man. I mean, you remember, this feels like a lifetime ago, but do you remember Rashid Shaheed and how the Saints were using him? MVS has just slotted into that Rashid Shaheed role, and it seems like Derek Carr really loves to have that sort of deep ball outlet guy that a few times a game he can just chuck it out there, and Carr throws a pretty deep ball. So I think you could do worse than kind of MVS is just like a dart throw, put him in your flex, and just hope he catches one of those long touchdowns. I mean, I've counted on Marquez Valdez-Scantling before in my fantasy career, and it almost never works out. But at this point, we're in the season, we're feeling kind of desperate in certain places, especially with all these buys. You mentioned Deontay Johnson earlier, but this one just hurts me so much. You got an Isaiah Likely listed here. I mean, I was an Isaiah Likely believer coming into the season. I think I believe in my heart of hearts that at this point in their careers, he might be just a better sort of athletic tight end than Mark Andrews is. Andrews is still that savvy, experienced veteran. But I think Likely is a really good athletic tight end. My policy on the Ravens going forward is that the only person that I can trust, other than Lamar, the only skill player that I can trust is Derrick Henry, because they can beat you, or in this case, this week, not beat you. But generally speaking, when their offense is clicking, they can use one of about 8 different guys to beat you, and you never know who that person is going to be, So this week I'm forced to put Likely in my starting tight end, at least right now. I haven't checked the waivers, but Kyle Pitts is on a bye. And so I'm starting Isaiah Likely this week. And there's a chance that he could score me 2 touchdowns. He did it the first game of the season, and I was super excited about him. There's a chance that he could totally disappear. And Deontay Johnson has totally disappeared. I cannot figure out that trade for the life of me. And at the time I said, I don't feel good about it. He was coming off a 16-point week, or PPR, I think it was something like a 19-point week against the Atlanta Falcons playing for the Panthers. I was feeling good about owning Deontay Johnson pretty much everywhere. And in the 5 weeks since, he has scored a combined 4.3 points. It is just brutal, man. It's brutal. And I think he's the kind of guy who is he's going to score 2 touchdowns in the divisional championship in the playoffs, right? If the Ravens, I think, could make it to the Super Bowl, he's going to be the kind of guy that catches 85 yards in the Super Bowl. And it was a really smart move for them to trade for him when they did. He might be totally irrelevant in the regular season. You're never going to know when to start him. And that hurts me so much, because I think that he's a good receiver, and I really believe in him coming into the season. And the Panthers are a terrible team.
Hey, 2-0 win streak.
The win streaking Panthers, I believe, are still not a very good team. It felt like a good thing for Deontay Johnson to escape, like when DJ Moore escaped a few years ago. And thus far, it has been a season killer. You can't use the guy, and it's going to take a few more weeks before you can even feel confident to start him. So that one has really hurt me.
I started him again, got 0 points. It's still won, baby. Still won. But no, I will admit and acknowledge, because we argued when that trade happened. I was wrong. You were right. So you had the better take on that one.
I don't want to be right about this.
You were
nervous
about
yeah,
it,
I don't want to be.
Right.
Yeah.
You were right. So I will give that to you. All right. Let's jump into some bandwagon riding this time of year. Who we feeling good about, and which guys are we going, no thank you. Here we go.
Get off the bandwagon.
It's time for bandwagon riding. Getting on, getting off. Make up your mind, all right?
All right, this is the time of the season where the teams are, they're right around 500. It's like, what direction are they going to go? And what does that mean for their players? And I think one of those teams that I know I was very high on coming into the season, and they had a nice little run there for a while, the Atlanta Falcons. And so they head into a bye. They've looked sloppy the last few weeks. And so the question becomes, are we hopping on or off Kirk Cousins, Kyle Pitts, even Darnell Mooney, Drake London? I mean, Bijan Robinson had a bad game this past week for his standards. And so I'm nervous. I will say this. I remain on the bandwagon for Bijan. I'm all in this year, so I will remain on that. But I am very tempted to even drop Kirk Cousins, especially going into the bye. I've got him in 2 leagues with what he's done the last couple of weeks. But I look back at his kind of his fantasy scores throughout the season. It's like, oh yeah, he had a big week there, big week there. He's had some really strong weeks. I think he's still like QB 12 maybe. So he's still, right there in the mix. I'm in a 14-team league, so he's still technically a starter, but I'm highly considering dropping him and getting off that bandwagon. And especially since they put Michael Penix in there, it's like he's there, floating around. I don't know. Coming out of a bye, I'll be curious. That first game back will be the determining factor. I don't know who they're playing, but whoever that is, if they look great, okay, fine. But if not, then there's definitely some panic at that point. What about for you?
It totally depends on where your team is in the playoff hunt. So when they come back from bye next week, they play the Chargers, another very good defense. I think that they just played the best defense in the NFL. I really believe that that's true about the Denver Broncos. They're on the short list for that category. And I would say the Chargers is a tough matchup coming back. But then after their playoff schedule is a juicy playoff schedule. So if you know that you're making the playoffs, I'm not talking so much about Cousins here, but I think you're not buying Bijan low. Nobody's trading Bijan away. But Drake London and to a certain extent Kyle Pitts, I think are potential buy low candidates if your league hasn't had its trade deadline yet. If you can make it into the playoffs, you get the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders. They're not bottom dweller defenses in the NFL, but they're lower half of the league, in my opinion. And I think that the Falcons will be able to score some points. And they may be in the position where they are playing for their playoff lives in the real NFL. And so they're slinging it around and kind of gunslinger. So yeah, I would say if you need production in the next few weeks, you can drop Cousins. You got to figure out an alternative to any of those guys with a couple of tough games coming up. But if you know that you're making it to the playoffs, the Falcons have a great playoff schedule. And a guy like Drake London, who the owner in your league is probably feeling pretty discouraged. Definitely Kyle Pitts, who caught 1 pass for 9 yards. That was super discouraging. And I think if you can hold on, those guys are going to score you some points in the playoffs.
All right. That's a good take. I'm gonna definitely hang on to Bijan, and I'll probably keep Darnell Mooney around too. He's been good for me early, but a couple injury concerns there for him too. But Kirk, yeah, like I said, I'm still jury's out on him. All right. Another team that sort of we're trying to figure out what direction they could go is the Chicago Bears. They make the offensive coordinator change. Waldron's out. I was actually surprised. I was like, oh yeah, Thomas Brown from the Panthers. He's now their guy. He used to be with the Panthers. Now he's the offensive coordinator calling plays for Chicago. The Bears looked much better. That was a heartbreaker to lose to Green Bay the way they did. They just looked a lot better. So DeAndre Swift, Roshan Johnson, 1-2 punch running back wise. I'm a big Rome Odunze guy. He looked much better. 6 catches, which was great. So I think I'm on the Bears bandwagon, and at least Bears players that I own, I'm hanging on to, feeling like, okay, the rest of the way we'll see some positive growth, some positive changes for them. Maybe Waldron really was the issue there. You're shaking your head no.
Waldron was part of the issue, but Eberflus is also
still there. He's still there.
A problem, right? If you watch this game, okay, this was incredible to me. At the end of the first half, they're on the 1-yard line, and there's about 25 seconds left on the clock, and they have 1 timeout. They run the clock all the way down to 10 seconds, call their timeout. It's like he was like, as opposed to taking a shot into the end zone, I'm gonna use my final timeout, and then at the end of the game, what's his name? Cairo Santos, who is known to not have the strongest leg. Like, he is not a big, long distance, like 50+ yard field goal guy. They still had a bunch of time, and they had a timeout. They kicked that field goal on 3rd down. They could have tried to run one more play to get 10 more yards, and then maybe that field goal isn't blocked. Eberflus has the ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in such an incredible way. And so their only goal for the rest of the season should be to try to build Caleb Williams' confidence. And I think that they know that. And so I'm optimistic for that offense going forward. But just never underestimate Matt Eberflus's ability to do something really weird that messes up your week in fantasy. So yeah, I think I'm on the Bears bandwagon. Happy to be a DJ Moore owner and to roll him out there, but just with the understanding that they could just have another one of these games where they look totally inept on offense, and that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Well, and there is a difference because, yeah, they might not win a lot of games, but I think their offense will be better. So I think I hear what you're saying. Yes, I'm not an Eberflus. I'm not on the bandwagon for him by any means.
Go back and look at the clock mismanagement at the end of both the first and second half, and then ask yourself, what if they'd taken one shot at DJ Moore, another 25 yards for DJ Moore? What if they had run a second play there when they were on the goal line at the end of the first half, and Cole Kmet gets a touchdown for you instead of whatever they ended up doing? It's just like, it's those little decisions where I'm like, they're not an sort of well-run and dynamic offense where I feel good about rolling those guys out there. They're going to surprise you with their ineptitude more often than they surprise you with like a good, solid blow-up week, And
they got some tough matchups ahead of them.
They do.
It's a tough division.
Brutal schedule.
They got a tough division, no question. All right, a couple guys I'm gonna jump on the bandwagon. I've mentioned it the last couple of weeks, but I'm still on that Blake Corum bandwagon with the Rams. I'm stashing him on my team. Jalen Wright, the running back in Miami, with Raheem Mostert maybe a little banged up. Jalen Wright's a guy to go snag on waivers. Of course, Devon Achane still there, but with the Dolphins looking better, playing better, have a nice schedule coming up, Jalen Wright's a guy to keep an eye out. Here is a tight end. All right. I'm not sure how we're related, but Theo Johnson. All right. Tight end for the Giants. Danny DeVito, baby. Tommy's out there, man. He's back. So let's jump on that Giants bandwagon. And Theo Johnson, rookie, 6'6", Penn State, tight end, looked good. The game before it was against the Panthers, but before their bye, he's involved. He's gotten 6 targets the last 2 games. This week with everybody on bye, I'm a big Evan Ingram guy, so he's out for a couple of leagues for me. Theo Johnson is a replacement for me. I've also mentioned Jatavian Sanders many times, Panthers tight end, another guy to snag. Jump on that bandwagon as well. So a couple of young tight ends that are rising up. So anybody else you're targeting on the waiver wire this week?
I don't think so, man. That's a great take. It's like Tommy DeVito is going to bring the spark. I think at some point Drew Lock gets a shot. Both of those, I think he'll get a shot before the end of the season, because I do think Tommy DeVito is going to sort of taper off just like he did last year. He's going to bring the spark, and then they're going to go elsewhere. But I will say both of those guys are better news for the pass catchers in New York than Daniel Jones was. So you can feel a little bit better about Malik Neighbors, and I like the Theo Johnson call. I think that's kind of a fun dart throw that you could look like the big brain guy in your league if you go pick up Theo and use him down the stretch here.
I actually got him. So on Yahoo, if a player is on a bye, he's still a free agent. I picked him up last night before waivers went through.
Interesting.
Like there's no way
that doesn't lock them.
Yeah, it was just last night.
Yeah.
So that was kind of nice.
There you go.
That was a little sneaky. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong, but hey, it was.
That's going to look like one of those big brain moves. Beat
the system there. So I like it. All right, we'll wrap up the show. We love to look across the league. What players scored surprising touchdowns? We've never heard of them before. And some of our favorite names around the league as well. So we ask, who is that?
Who is that? Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
You say with the help of Mark Wahlberg. So there you go. All right, let's start in New England. They continue. That offense looks okay these days with Drake May. But how about Vidarian Lowe? He caught a touchdown.
Seriously, who is that? Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
New England offensive lineman, tackle eligible. What a play for Vidarian Lowe. Never heard of him. All right, how about the New York Jets? They have a tough time. I mean, they were in the game with the Colts. It took a game-winning drive for Anthony Richardson, but who scored for the Jets? Not my boy Garrett Wilson. No. It was Kenny Yeboah.
Come on, seriously, who is that? Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
Kenny Yeboah, tight end, 1 catch, 11 yards, and a touchdown. All right, and then how about Nate Atkins?
Come on, seriously, who is that? Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
I don't know who he is. Where is he at? He's a tight end somewhere. 1 catch, 12 yards, and a touchdown. Nate
Cleveland?
Atkins. Seems like Cleveland. Yeah, that sounds about right.
No, Denver. So
Denver,
orange. I saw the orange.
The Denver Broncos have 15 tight ends. I think we've mentioned all of them this season.
True, man.
During Who Is That?
They've got 15 tight ends, and they're all the same guy. They're just good for one catch for 11 yards and a TD. And it's going to be Dolchitz or Troutman or Adkins. They're all these sort of corn-fed tight ends that you're going to catch one pass for you.
Oh, speaking of the Broncos, we do have to mention this. Audric Estime. I mean, he was all the hype last week. I got him in one league. I wasn't like overly in on him, but I did just in case. Non-factor. I mean, Sean Payton and his mind games and talk about fantasy shenanigans in that backfield. I'm thankful that I've, for the most part, avoided that backfield this year because they do fine. Like they're a good team. They're running the ball at times. You just don't know who it's going to be. Jaleel McLaughlin, Javonte Williams. One day, Javonte Williams is like, wow, this is the guy they drafted. This guy's awesome. And then the next week disappears and it's some other guy. And it's just craziness.
Can I ask you, are the Broncos making the playoffs?
Oh, I don't think so. I will be surprised.
I think they are. And
They're
I sort of think
like they are.
Yeah, Sean Payton's sort of head games that he likes to do with the whole, like, it does seem to work when you've got that older running back that seems like they're not putting in maximal effort to say, hey, well, we're going to put the young guy in. And just sort of dangle Audric Estime out there. And Javonte, I saw one run where he looked angry. So maybe that's the boost that he needed. But I think they think they're making the playoffs, and I think that Estime is going to be an important part of like kind of.
Oh, you're still buying in.
No, not that I. To be clear, I don't want to play him, but I wouldn't be surprised if Audric Estime is the kind of game like where in the wild card game of the playoffs, he runs for 95 yards and a touchdown, and people are like, "Who is this guy?" I think that's what Sean Payton thinks, and I wouldn't be totally surprised if it happens, man. They look pretty good. They look pretty good. Pretty good.
I still don't fully understand how they're doing it, but yeah, great defense. Bo Nix continues to
he's loosened up a little bit.
He's us.
Running and moving around in the pocket, slinging it around a little, looking for Cortland Sutton.
This is turning out to be a pretty good rookie quarterback class, at least what they're doing as rookies. How does it translate moving forward? But Drake May, Jaden Daniels, who's struggled a little bit lately, but we know what he's capable of. And Caleb Williams has had his moments, so they look like they're going to be starters in the NFL, all of them for a while. Yeah, it's been impressive. So we'll mention this. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, our favorite guy, our favorite member of Who Is That? First team all Who Is That?
And just copy and paste him into this section for next week, man, because he does it every week now. Yeah,
he caught a 98-yard touchdown, the longest score in the NFL this year. That's who scored?
Come on, seriously, who is that? Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Ikhine.
I think it's Ikhine. Yeah.
Ikhine. There you go. So, all right, that's this week's Who Is That? But man, fun show as always. Trip, great to be with you. Let's stop pointing the finger and blaming everybody else in fantasy and in life. Just take ownership.
Take ownership. Now is the time to make your playoff push. You don't need a blame shift. Everything that happened before this week doesn't matter. What are you going to do to make the playoffs with your team? Don't blame anybody. You got this. You can do it.
That's right. And there's still some backup running backs that are going to be league winners. I'm telling you, it happens every year. Who's it going to be? Stash a few of those guys on your bench. Get ready for the final few weeks as we head into the playoffs. So hope you have a wonderful week. For Trip and Aaron, I'm Bryce. I'm a fantasy manager who follows Jesus. I believe in the good news that he died on the cross for my sin. He was resurrected. And through faith, I've been saved by his grace. I hope that is true for you as well. And I hope you'll join me as we live life as fantasy managers who follow Jesus together. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you next time right here on the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast.